Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western literary canon out loud. Today we continue our series on Ralph Waldo Emerson, specifically the journals. We are up to journal collection number 28, which is the collected journals from the year 1837, when the author was 34 years old, already remarried, and living in Concord. And with that said, it does begin with an untranslated quotation from Horace. And per my rules, if the editor himself has not given us the translation, I will simply reference that there is a quotation from whatever philosopher, novelist, or whoever it is, and continue. Otherwise, to stop and try to hunt down each of these quotations and find an English translation for 10 volumes of journals, it's just not practical to do anything close to that. So if the editor himself, who supposedly had advertises this collection as annotated, he doesn't do a lot of translating for the English American reader. So with that said, we'll go ahead and skip over the Horace quotation. I will just say it's from the Satires, Lib 2, 1 is what it says, and then underneath there are a couple lines here which state, I write the laws, not plead a cause. And then the editor gives us a little bit of a update on what's going on in Emerson's life at this time. So I'll read that, and then from there I will continue to the journals themselves. The happy domestic life went on, with friends and visitors coming and going, and the lecturing in Boston, involving long and cold stage rides, continued until midwinter was past. The course, the philosophy of history, was largely attended and very successful. Meantime, Mr. Emerson preached each Sunday at East Lexington. Concord, January 3rd, 1837. It occurred last night, in groping after the elements of that pleasure we derive from literary compositions, that it is like the pleasure which the Prince Lebeau received from seeing himself for the first time in a mirror, a mysterious and delightful surprise. A poem, a sentence causes us to see ourselves. I see my being at the same time. It is not some wild ornithorhynchus nondescript that attracts the most attention, but it was the man of the New World that concentrated the curiosity of the contemporaries of Columbus. After I got into bed, somewhat else rolled through my head and returned betwixt dreams, which I fear I have lost. It seems as if it were to purport that every particular composition takes its fit in the intellectual sphere. The light and gay a light and fugitive place, the wise a permanent place, but only those works are everlasting which have caught not the ephemeral and local, but the universal symbols of thought, and so written themselves in a language that needs no translation into the sympathies and intellectual habits of all men, Homer and Shakespeare. January 7th. Received, day before yesterday, a letter from Thomas Carlyle, dated 5th November. As ever, a cordial influence. Strong he is, upright, noble, and sweet, and makes good how much of our human nature. Quite in consonance with my delight in his eloquent letters, I read in Bacon this afternoon this sentence of letters, and such as are written from wise men are of all the words of man, and in my judgment the best, for they are more natural than orations and public speeches, and more advised than conferences or present speeches. Let nothing be lost that is good. Is chivalry graceful in your imagination? Be courteous to every boy and girl in the village, and so keep its soul alive. Is honor majestic? With the courtesy be doggedly just, and speak the truth, and you shall call out the angel everywhere who lurks under ignorance and cunning. Discourtesy and selfishness are the short-sighted owls. Hold all conventions of society light in your reverence for simple instinct, so shall you receive the age of the Greeks and of Shakespeare. Fear God, and where you shall go, men shall feel as if they walked in hallowed cathedrals. Make your perceptions accurate, and the sound of your voice or sight of your name shall be useful to men as institutes and scientific societies are, suggesting the just use of your faculties to great ends. This is the way to be a universal man, or take the ages up into an hour in one person. January 8th. Can you not show the man of genius that always genius is situated in the world as it is with him? Lydian Emerson, Waldo Emerson, R. Waldo Emerson. I have come no farther in my query than this, when mine Asia came in and wrote her name, her sons and her husbands to warm my cold page. January 9th. Always a fresh swarm is alighting in the places of power to suck suddenly all its sweets, and with such guides as Rehoboam's young men would discard ever the wise and run riot, but that things refuse to be ill administered. Nothing satisfies all men but justice, and especially when time and much debate has accurately ascertained what justice is in respect to any measure. The interests of all classes are so intimately united that although the rivalry in which they are often set may please one for a short time with the distress of another, yet very quickly they will make common cause against any great offense. Virtue is continually reproduced in the young, and the selfish statesman has some. Great men arise like Alfred, Washington, Lafayette, and virtue has resistless effect. Nothing is more apparent than that genuine virtue always tells for such. The majesty of these men impresses the people, and the government are forced to defer to it. The eclat of good code, or a domestic improvement, or a commercial treaty, or a scientific survey or expedition is desired, and each of these things stimulates the mind of the people, cultivates them, and so tends to acquaint them with their true interest. The expedition of Alexander, of Caesar, of Napoleon, not without good fruit. The interests of persons and property are so difficult to separate that it is very happy that the progress of society tends to reconcile and to identify them. By destroying the class of paupers, of slaves, and making every man a proprietor, then as every penny carries it with some knowledge, he becomes fit to distribute it. Thus the peace and trade party grows up, the lovers of useful knowledge. Quote, man has no predilection for absurdity. End quote. The law, the polity that endures 1,000 years, has some fitness to the human constitution. Every law that continues long alive tallies to something in man. January 14th. Lydian's grandmother had a slave, Phyllis, whom she freed. Phyllis went to a little colony on the outside of Plymouth, which they called New Guinea. Soon after, she visited her old mistress. Well, Phyllis, what did you have for dinner on Thanksgiving Day? Fried taters, missy, replied Phyllis. And what had you to fry the potatoes in? Said Mrs. Cotton. Fried in water, missy, answered the girl. Well, Phyllis, said Mrs. Cotton, how can you bear to live up there so poor when here you used to have everything comfortable and such a good dinner at Thanksgiving? Ah, missy, freedom's sweet, returned Phyllis. January 16th. How evanescent is the idea of spirit, how incomprehensible! Strange obstinacy of the human affections to enshrine wisdom and virtue in a person, and no less obstinacy in the reason not to admit the picture. The mystery is to be explained only by the personability of virtue and wisdom in the seer himself. But as far as history is concerned, can I not show that in regard to this element of civilization man underlies the same necessity as in science, arts, letters, politics? For always is such religion as there is, so much appears. All the devils respect virtue. Always the high, heroic, self-devoted sect shall instruct and command mankind. Hypocrisy is a foolish suicide. All virtue consists in subsisting being for seeming, and therefore God sublimely saith, I am. Yes, justice is, love is, and that deep cause of causes which they, as it were, outwardly represent. But is God a person? No, that is a contradiction, the personality of God. A person is finite, personality is finiteness. The universal mind is so far from being measured in any finite numbers that its verdict would be vitiated at once by any reference to numbers, however large. The multitude is the worst argument, and in fact the only way of arriving at this universal mind is to quit the whole world and take counsel of the bosom alone. January 21st. Every change in the physical constitution has its external sign, although for the most part it is not heeded. Hemorrhage of the lungs or palsy does not suddenly overtake a man, but after long warnings which he had disregarded. Look at the clock. You have only noticed the striking of the hours, but it struck the seconds, and showed the seconds and minutes on the dial which were making up the hour, but you had no ears and no eyes. I either read or inferred today in the Westminster Review that Shakespeare was not a popular man in his day. How true and wise! He sat alone and walked alone, a visionary poet, and came with his piece, modest but discerning, to the players, and was too glad to get it received, whilst he was too superior not to see in its transcendent claims. January 22nd. Being a lover of solitude, I went to live in the country 70 miles from Boston, and there the northwest wind with all his snows took me in charge and defended me from all company in winter, and the hills and sandbanks that intervened between me and the city kept guard in summer. January 25th. This evening the heavens afford us the most remarkable spectacle of aurora borealis. A deep red plume in the east and west streaming almost from the horizon to the zenith, forming at the zenith a sublime coronet. The stars peep delicately through the ruddy folds, and the whole landscape below covered with snow is crimsoned. The light meantime equal nearly to that of full moon, although the moon was not risen. January 27th. The best use of money is to pay debts with it. The only aristocracy in this country is the editors of newspapers. As Goethe says that any particular bone that is in one animal may be found in every other, however abridged or obscure, so I am never quite acquainted with my neighbor until I have found somewhat in his nature and life to tally with everything I know of myself. January 29th. One has patience with every kind of living thing, but not with the dead alive. I, at least, hate to see persons of that lumpish class who are here, they know not why, and ask not where to, but live as the larva of the ant or the bee, to be lugged into the sun, and then lugged back into the cell, and then fed. The end of nature for such is that they should be fatted. If mankind should pass a vote on the subject, I think they would throw them in sacks into the sea. Party. The quote-unquote Globe newspaper has its lie for each new emergency to hoodwink its honest millions, as we in Massachusetts put a headboard on a cow lest she break fences. February 3rd. While Stetson whispered at the ordination, I could not help thinking that the next to so notable a wit should always be posted a phlegmatic, bolt, upright man, able to stand without movement of muscle whole broadsides of this Greek fire. And yet the person who has just received this discharge, if in a solemn company, has the very air much of a stout vessel, which has just shipped a heavy sea, and though it does not split it, the poor bark is for the moment critically staggered. Charles, in a conversation I have mentioned in my old journal, expressed much such an opinion as Montaigne, who says of himself that, quote, if there is any good in him, it came in by treachery, end quote. Then there's an untranslated quotation from Persius, followed by this, let a man behave in his own house as a guest. February 6th. In these lectures, which from week to week I read, each on a topic which is a main interest of man, and may be made an object of exclusive interest, I seem to vie with the brag of Puck. Quote, I can put a girdle round about the world in 40 minutes. I take 50. A great law, quote, what we have within, that only can we see without, only so much of Arabian history can I read as I am Arabian within, though I should parse and spell Ockley and Abulfeda. February 20th. Life tends to be picturesque. I think O'Connell's South Sea Islands the best book we have published in this country this long while. Warren Street Chapel is all a holy hurrah. Old and new put their stamp to everything in nature. The snowflake that is now falling is marked by both. The present moment gives the motion and the color of the flake, antiquity its form and properties. All things wear a luster which is the gift of the present and a tarnish of time. March 4th. I have finished on Thursday evening last my course of 12 lectures on the philosophy of history. I read the first on the 8th of December, 1836. The audience attending them might average 350 persons. I acknowledge the divine providence which has given me perfect health and smoothed the way unto the end. March 14th. Edward Taylor came last night and gave us in the old church a lecture on temperance. A wonderful man. I had almost said a perfect orator. The utter want and loss of all method, the ridicule of all method, the bright chaos come again of his bewildering oratory certainly bereaves it of power. But what splendor, what sweetness, what richness, what depth, what cheer! How he conciliates, how he humanizes, how he exhilarates and ennobles. Beautiful philanthropist, godly poet, the Shakespeare of the sailor and the poor. God has found one harp of divine melody to ring and sigh sweet music amidst caves and cellars. He spent the night with me. He says he lives a monarch's life and has none to control him or to divide the power with him. His word is law for all his people and his coadjutors. He is a very charming object to me. I delight in his great personality, the way and sweep of the man which, like a frigate's way, takes up, for the time, the center of the ocean, paves it with a white street, and all the lesser craft, quote, do curtsy to him, do him reverence, Everybody plays a second part in his presence, and takes a deferential and apologetic tone. In the church, likewise, everybody, the rich, the poor, the scoffer, the drunkard, the exquisite, and the populace, acknowledge the man, and feel that to be right and lordly which he doth, so that his prayer is a winged ship in which all are floated forward. The wonderful and laughing life of all his illustration keeps us broad awake. A string of rockets all night. He described his bar-room gentry as, quote, hanging like a half-dead bird over a counter, He describes Helen Loring as out on her errands of charity and, quote, running through the rain like a beach bird, He speaks of poor ministers coming out of divinity schools, etc., as poor fellows hobbling out of Jerusalem. We'll give you hypocrites for honest men, 2 for 1, and trade all night. The world is just large enough for the people. There is no room for a partition wall. March 18th. A strong south wind today set all the hills and fields afloat under melting snowbanks. Tempted out by the new brown of the hillsides, I climbed for the first time since autumn the opposite hill to see if the snows were abated and my wood alleys open, but there was too much winter left, and I retreated. March 19th. Today at Waltham I talked of the potential invention of all men. Caroline Sturgis can sketch with invention, others can draw as well, but cannot design. I call it self-distrust, a fear to launch away into the deep which they might freely and safely do. It is as if the dolphins should float on rafts, or creep and squirm along the shore in fear to trust themselves to the element which is really native to them. I read not long ago in the newspapers that the school committee in Boston had sustained the master of one of the public schools in his forbidal of the practice of the girls to come to school occasionally with their hair in papers. Every man has a hydrophobia the first time in summer he goes into the salt water baths. As you sit in the tavern and see the stage passengers come in to warm them, a new generation each hour, men seem to be on the confines of uncontrollable laughter all the time, and always, too, on the edge of the sublime. We are up to anything, Ligurus-like, godlike, or devilish. Our carpets and paper hangings and molded woodwork in every house show the existence of fine taste somewhere, which, like the blue of the sky or the gaiety of the clouds, blesses every eye without being noticed by hardly one. The popularity of Tom's statues of old mortality and Tam O'Shanter is a good problem. So the experiments on living, the papers say that 10,000 copies of Living Without Means were sold in less than 10 days, 12 editions in 11 days. I doubt they lie, and 20,000 copies of the 3 experiments have been sold. Quote, lively feeling of the circumstance and faculty to express it makes the poet, end quote. Goethe. Quote, they say much of the study of the ancients, but what else does that signify than direct your attention to the real world and seek to express it, since that did the ancients whilst they lived, end quote. Goethe. Wifey says, as proud as the child that has sewed her first stitch. March 29th. Noble paper of Carlyle on Mirabeau. This peace will establish his kingdom, I forebode in the mind of his countrymen. How he gropes with giant fingers into the dark of man, into the obscure recesses of power and human will, and we are encouraged by his word to feel the might that is in a man. Come, quote, the ruggedest hour that time and fate dare bring to frown upon the enraged Northumberland, end quote. Indeed, this piece is all thunder, gigantic portrait painting. The diamond necklace, too, I doubt not, is the sifted story, the veritable fact as it fell out, yet so strangely told by a series of pictures, cloud upon cloud, that the eye of the exact man is speedily confused and annoyed. It seems to me his genius is the redolence of London, quote, the great metropolis, quote, so vast, enormous, with endless details, and so related to all the world is he. It would seem as if no baker shop, no mutton stall, no academy, no church, no placard, no coronation, but he saw and sympathized with all, and took all up into his omnivorous fancy, memory. Thence his panoramic style, and this encyclopedical allusion to all the knowables. Then he is a worshipper of strength, heedless much whether its present phase be divine or diabolic. Burns, George Fox, Luther, and those unclean beasts, Diderot, Danton, Mirabeau, whose sinews are their own and who trample on the tutoring and conventions of society, he loves. For he believes that every noble nature was made by God and contains, if savage passions also fit checks and grand impulses within it, hath its own resources, and however erring, will return from far. Then he writes English and crowds meaning into all the nooks and corners of his sentences. Once read, he is but half read. I rode well. My horse took hold of the road as if he loved it. I saw in Boston my fair young Elle, but so rashly grown that her sweet face was like a violet on the top of a pole. Carlyle again. I think he has seen, as no other in our time, how inexhaustible a mine is the language of conversation. He does not use the written dialect of the time, in which scholars, pamphleteers, and the clergy write, nor the parliamentary dialect, in which the lawyers, the statesmen, and the better newspapers write, but draws strength and mother wit out of a poetic use of the spoken vocabulary, so that his paragraphs are all a sort of splendid conversation. Next is a passage called The Antique. Quote, "The Lacedaemonians, entering into battle, sacrificed to the Muses, to the end that their actions might be well and worthily writ." End quote. Montaigne. Quote, "The ancient Romans kept their youth always standing, and taught them nothing that they were to learn sitting." End quote. Seneca, Apud Montaigne. I learned from Montaigne, a master of antiquity, also, that when the ancient Greeks would accuse any other of extreme insufficiency, they would say that he could neither read nor swim. The Peloponnesian League stipulated that, quote, "whatever was agreed on by a majority of the confederates should be binding on all, unless some god or hero enjoined dissent." End quote. Thucydides, Volume 2. The ethical writings of the ancients are without cant. The ancients are no transcendentalists. They rest always in the spontaneous consciousness. April 1st. Yesterday I received from Carlyle a letter, a copy of Mirabeau, of the diamond necklace, and a proof sheet of the French Revolution. Blessings on the friend. Today I finished a letter to him. April 7th. My baby's lovely drama still goes forward, though he catches sad colds and wheezes and grieves. Yet again he sputters and spurs and puts on his little important faces and looks dignified and frets and sleeps again. We call him Little Pharisee, who, when he fasts, sounds a trumpet before him. The man of genius, Swedenborg or Carlyle or Alcott, is ever, as Shelley says of his Skylark, quote, "like a poet hidden in the light of thought, singing hymns unbidden till the world is wrought. To sympathy with hopes and fears it heeded not." End quote. April 8th. Ah, my darling boy, so lately received out of heaven, leave me not now. Please God, this sweet symbol of love and wisdom may be spared to rejoice, teach, and accompany me. People expect to read a lesson of the divine providence in a death or a lunacy, as they would read a paragraph in a newspaper, and when they cannot, they say, like my Irishman Roger Herring to the probate court, quote, "Well, I am not satisfied." End quote. But one lesson we are to learn is the course or genius of the divine providence, which a malady or any fact which cannot teach but a sober view of the events of years, the action and reaction of the character and events may. April 10th. Very just are the views of Goethe and Eckermann, that the poet stands too high than that he should be a partisan. I thought as I rode through the sloughs yesterday that nothing is more untrue as well as unfavorable to power than that the thinker should open his mind to fear of the people among whom he works. Rather let him exult in his force. Whichever way he turns, he sees the pleasure and deference which these faculties of writing and speaking excite. The people call them out, the people delight in them. The better part of every man feels, "This is my music." Surely, therefore, the poet should respond and say, "The people and not solitude is my home. Never my lands, my stocks, my salary, but this power to help and to charm the disguised soul that sits veiled under this whiskered and that smooth visage. This is my rent and ration." Love and eye water. Slavery is an institution for converting men into monkeys. All the professions are timid and incomplete agencies. The priest has some reference to the exigencies of the parish, some to his own, and much regard to the faculty and course of his own thought. He says his prayers and his sermon, and is very glad if they answer to the case of any one individual, if they bring the smallest spiritual aid to any soul. If to 2, if to 10, it is a signal success. But he walked to the church without any assurance that he knew the distemper or could heal it. The physician prescribes hesitatingly out of his few resources the same stimulus or sedative to this new and peculiar constitution which he has applied with various success to 1,000 men before. If the patient mends, he is glad and surprised, but to himself he could not predict it. The lawyer advises the client and tells his story to the jury and leaves it with them, and is as gay and as much relieved as the client if it turns out that he has a verdict. He could not predict it. The judge weighs the arguments and puts a brave face on the matter, and since there must be a decision, decides as he can and hopes he has done justice and given satisfaction to the community, but is only an advocate after all, and so is all life a timid and unskilful spectator. Quote, "If God to build the house deny, the builders work in vain." April 11th. I wrote George Bradford that Eckermann was full of fine things and helps one much in the study of Goethe. Always the man of genius dwells alone, and like the mountain pays the tax of snows and silence for elevation. It would seem as if he hunted out this poor Dutch Boswell for a thing to talk to, that his thoughts might not pass in smother. His thinking, as far as I read him, is of great altitude and all level. But he is a pledge that the antique force of nature is not spent, and 'tis gay to think what men shall be. Is not life a puny, unprofitable discipline, whose direct advantage may be fairly represented by the direct education that is got at Harvard College? As is the real learning gained there, such is the proportion of the lesson in life. April 12th. I find it the worst thing in life that I can put it to no better use. One would say that he can have little to do with his time who sits down to so slow labor and of such doubtful return as studying Greek or German, as he must be an unskilful merchant who should invest his money at 3%. Yet I know not how better to employ a good many hours in the year. If there were not a general as well as a direct advantage herein, we might shoot ourselves. Where I see anything done, I behold the presence of the Creator. Peter Howe knows what to do in the garden, and Sullivan at a ball, and Webster in the Senate, and I over my page. Exchange any of our works, and we should be to seek, and any work looks wonderful to me except that one which I can do. How little of the man see we in his person. The man Minot, who busies himself all the year round under my windows, writes out his nature in 100 works, in drawing water, hewing wood, building fence, feeding his cows, haymaking, and a few times in the year he goes into the woods. Thus his human spirit unites itself with nature. Why need I ever hear him speak articulate words? I listen by night, I gaze by day at the endless procession of wagons loaded with the wealth of all the regions of England and China, of Turkey, of the Indies, which from Boston creep by my gate to all the towns of New Hampshire and Vermont. With creaking wheels at midsummer and crunching the snows on huge sledges in January, the train goes forward at all hours, bearing this cargo of inexhaustible comfort and luxury to every cabin in the hills. April 16th. How little think the youth and maiden who are glancing at each other across a mixed company with eyes so full of mutual intelligence, how little they think of the precious fruit long hereafter to proceed from this now quite external stimulus. Wretch is a Gothic genius, not the Greek simplicity, but the Gothic redundancy of meaning and elaboration of details. His pictures are like Herbert's poems, hard to read for every word is to be emphasized. The newspapers persecute Alcott. I have never more regretted my inefficiency in practical ends. I was born a seeing eye, not a helping hand. I can only comfort my friends by thought, and not by love or aid. But they naturally look for this other also, and thereby vitiate our relation throughout. Camper complains to Merck that, quote, what happened in regard to petrifications has happened to him in regard to his collection of diseased bones, to wit, that he created the taste in Holland, in France, in Germany, and now is not able to get any specimen, no, not for money, end quote. Simmering possessed in his cabinet the hand of a certain Paul de Viguier, nearly 300 years old. This beautiful person was such an object of universal wonder to her contemporaries for her enchanting form, virtue, and accomplishments, that according to the assurances of one of them, the citizens of her native city, Toulouse, obtained the aid of the civil authorities to compel her to appear publicly on the balcony at least twice a week, and as often as she showed herself the crowd was dangerous to life. So Lady Hamilton was a modern Helen. Mine Asia grudges the time she is called away from her babe, because he grows so fast that each look is new, and each is never to be repeated. Dr. Ripley told us of the clergyman in Marlborough who in the Revolution prayed the Lord, quote, to look on us in these very peaked times, end quote. Good letter from Tischbein to Merck describing Michelangelo's Last Judgment, which he had the opportunity of seeing very near, and was astonished at the minute finish of muscles and nerves finished like a miniature. Quote, a group of the damned whom the devils drive into hell made me so much distressed that I feared I should fall from the ladder. I was forced to hold on with both hands and to banish the shuddering thoughts. End quote. April 21st. New England. It has been to me a sensible relief to learn that the destiny of New England is to be the manufacturing country of America. I no longer suffer in the cold out of morbid sympathy with the farmer. The love of the farmer shall spoil no more days for me. Climate touches not my own work. The foulest or the coldest wind is as dear to the muses as the sweet southwest, and so to the manufacturer and the merchant. Where they have the sun, let them plant. We who have it not will drive our pens and water wheels. I am as gay a canary bird with this new knowledge. An opinion is seldom given, and every one we have heard of weighs with us. Let an opinion be given upon a book, the vis inertia of the general mind is proved by the circulation this sentence has. It runs through a round of newspapers and of social circles, and finds mere acquiescence in thousands. If the subject is one which has a political or commercial bearing, it commonly happens that another individual protests against the opinion and affirms his own to be just the reverse. In that case, still I should think there is but one opinion affirmed and denied. There is yet no new quality shown. Woe unto you, critics, for an opinion is indeed not the safest ware to deal in. I learn evermore in smooth water I discover the motion of my boat by the motion of the trees and houses on shore. So the progress of my mind is proved by the perpetual change in the persons and things I daily behold. Quote, the alphabet is a work of the mouth, meter a work of the pulse, end quote, says Zelter. Napoleon said, and this is not translated from the French. April 22nd. Culture. How much meaning the Germans affix to the word, and how unlike to the English sense. The Englishman goes to see a museum or a mountain for itself, the German for himself, the Englishman for entertainment, the German for culture. The German is conscious and his aims are great. The Englishman lives from his eyes and immersed in the apparent world. Our culture comes not alone from the grand and beautiful, but also from the trivial and sordid. We wash and cleanse out every day for 60 years this temple of the human body. We buy wood and tend our fires and deal with a baker and fisherman and grocer and take a world of pains which nothing but concealed moral and intellectual ends of great worth can exalt to an ideal level. If we knew we were in a purgatory, if we knew of crimes and are now in hell, the lowness and filths of life were then explained, but we are void of such consciousness. Polarity is a law of all being. If the mind idealizes at one end perfect goodness into God, coexistently it abhors at the other end a devil. Cold April. Hard times, men breaking who ought not to break, banks bullied into the bolstering of desperate speculators, all the newspapers a chorus of owls. Quote, tobacco, cotton, teas, indigo, and timber all at tremendous discount, and the end not yet. End quote. 8 firms in London gave the bank a round-robin bond for £3,800,000 of discounts. Such things I read in the newspapers, especially London Age of March 12th. Loud cracks in the social edifice. 60,000 laborers, says rumor, to be presently thrown out of work, and these make a formidable mob to break open banks and rob the rich, and brave the domestic government. May 5th. In New York, the president, Fleming of the Mechanics' Bank, resigns, and the next morning is found dead in his bed, quote, by mental excitement, end quote, according to the verdict of the coroner. Added bitterness from the burning of the exchange in New Orleans by an incendiary, the park mobs, and the running on banks for specie in New York. Fine weather, yes, but cold. Warm day, yes, but dry. You look well. I am very well, except a little cold. The case of damaged hats, one a broken brim, the other perfect in the brim, but rubbed on the side, the third whole in the cylinder, but bruised on the crown. I say to Lydian that in composition the what is of no importance compared with the how. The most tedious of all discourses are on the subject of the Supreme Being. April 23rd. How much benefit in the common well-meaning private person. I was at Wayland today, and could not help feeling and expressing a gratitude to that worthy R. Hurd as to a main column on which their municipal and ecclesiastical well-being leans. And again, what a benefactress to the place is the beautiful singer Mrs. M., only by her voice in the church. Trust your nature, the common mind. Fear not to sound its depths, to ejaculate its grander emotions. Fear not how men shall take it. See you not they are following your thought and emotion because it leads them deeper into their own? I see with joy I am speaking their word, fulfilling their nature, when I thought the word and nature most my own. All good writing might be called occasional poems, as it is only a composition of many visions in the writer's private experience. The young find a keener pleasure in the riot of the imagination than any which nature has in store, and by means of natural pleasures in later life they are cured of their delicious madness. Meantime, what a dupe is the libertine! He thinks he has the sparkle and the color of the cup, and the chaste merry pair only the lees. They see that he stays always in the base court, and never has one glimpse of the high joys of a perfect wedlock. Quote, what you love not, you cannot do, end quote. Zelter. What pleases me will please many. April 26th. More conversation about the German man. Furthermore, as he describes the devil as the great negation, or as Carlyle says, the lie is the second best, God and truth being the first, so it would appear as if he aimed himself to be the third term, or the universal quiz, a sort of bridge from the truth to the lie. He thought it necessary, therefore, to dot round, as it were, the entire spheres of knowables, and for many of his stories this seems the only reason. On the whole, what have these German Weimarish art friends done? They have rejected all the traditions and conventions, have sought to come thereby one step nearer to absolute truth, but still they are not nearer than others. I do not draw from them great influence. The heroic, the holy, I lack. They are contemptuous. They fail in sympathy with humanity. The voice of nature they bring me to hear is not divine, but ghastly, hard, and ironical. They do not illuminate me. They do not edify me. Plutarch's heroes cheer, exalt. The old blood-warm Miltons and Sidneys and Pauls help and aggrandize me. The roots of what is great and high must still be in the common life. Christianity. To those fundamental natures that lie at the basis of the soul, truth, justice, love, etc., the idea of eternity is essentially associated. Jesus, a pure intellect, exclusively devoted to this class of abstractions, the ethical, did never yet utter one syllable about the naked immortality of the soul, never spoke of simple duration. His disciples felt, as all must, the coexisting perception of eternity, and separated it and taught it as a doctrine, and maintained it by evidences. It ought never to be. It is an impertinence to struggle up for the immortality. It is inevitable to believe it, if you come down upon the conviction from the seeing these primary natures in the mind. This is the end of Part 1 of Emerson's Journal Collection number 28. In the next video, we will pick up where we left off on April 29th. Thank you for listening.